Fixing aged care at a cost. The two major parties have agreed self-funded retirees should pay more for their care. They're also in broad agreement on something else, banning children from social media. I'm David Speers. Welcome to Insiders. Reform, it seems, is still possible. After long and confidential negotiations, Labor and the Coalition reached a deal to lift the standard of aged care in Australia and ease some of the pressure it's putting on the budget. Part pensioners and self-funded retirees will pay more. And while some aren't happy, both sides of politics are hoping most Australians will agree it's worth it. There are plenty of other fights right now over government spending, inflation and how to fix the housing crisis. But on this, the major parties had an interest in finding common ground.
Faced with an ageing population and ballooning costs, the government has hammered out a deal with the opposition after months of backroom negotiations.
We are putting the care back into aged care.
The federal government is spruiking a $6 billion promise. It's aimed at keeping older Australians safe and in their homes.
We are re-gearing the entire system of aged care in this country to be about supporting you at home.
But it comes with a warning, there will be more costs.
A fully supported pensioner with few assets would pay up to $300 more. A part pensioner who owns a home up to $4,700 more, while a self-funded retiree could be hit with an extra $13,400 more.
Nobody already in aged care will be asked to contribute more to the cost of their care.
Early this week, it was possibly going to fall over, the government now having struck a deal.
Incredibly rare bipartisan accord on something so important.
We certainly reserve our right to move amendments.
This is where we landed.
This is their bill, this is their reform package.
There's a lot of concern within the coalition about it.
There's a Senate inquiry that will tease out a lot of the detail and people can have their say in relation to that.
Aged care should be above politics.
Those with means did say they were happy to pay more as long as they could see it was delivering quality services.
This Act, when it passes, and being introduced is just the first step, although it is a fantastic one, that should make us sustainable.
It is a real privilege to work in aged care. It is some of the most meaningful work you could ever hope to do.
Thanks very much. See you at question time. Thank you.
My guest this morning is the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume. First, let's check what's making news. A sweeping review of Australia's national fertility policy has recommended cheaper access to IVF for same-sex couples, single women and low-income families. The review, led by former Health Minister Greg Hunt and embryologist Dr Rachel Swift, has found the current system's failing to keep up with rising demand. With IVF costing up to $10,000 a cycle, it recommends extending Medicare subsidies to same-sex and solo parents and creating one uniform national law. In the Sunday Age, ousted Liberal MP Moira Deeming claimed she was receiving support from senior federal Liberals, including opposition leader Peter Dutton, in her fight against Victorian Liberal leader John Pesutto. That's according to a trove of text messages and emails. Deeming and Pesutto are due to face off for the first day of a 3-week defamation trial in the federal court tomorrow. And in the Sunday Telegraph, a statewide mobile phone ban has turned back time in New South Wales schools, with kids spending more time playing, paying more attention in class and behaving better. It's nearly 12 months since the ban was introduced and teachers have reported a decrease in suspensions and bullying and an increase in attendance, focus and physical activity in the playground. We'll get to the plan to ban kids from social media a little later. We're going to start, though, with the aged care deal. The Coalition has typically opposed any hit on self-funded retirees, which makes this agreement so politically interesting. There was some pushback in the Coalition party room. One Nationals MP told me he's worried about losing votes over this to One Nation. But others in the Liberal Party knew they had to back serious and sensible reform here. One told me there's huge intergenerational inequity, and whatever we can do to peel that back and ease the burden on working-age taxpayers, we should. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Jacob Greber, Clare Armstrong and Waleed Aly. Welcome to you all. Very good morning. Look, let's start, Jacob, on this aged care deal. We'll get to the politics of it, but the policy, it is a complex area and these are complicated changes. What do people need to understand about what's changing here?
So the main change is there's more support, more money for people who do not have the means to fund themselves, and the self-funded retirees will be paying more. The government is overall trying to save around about $12 billion over a decade or more. That will unlock more money for people to stay in their homes for longer, which is, you know, that's the ugly truth of life. The last few years of your life are the most expensive in terms of healthcare and
people want to stay at home longer too.
People want to stay at home. So the biggest hit would be someone who owns their own home, has assets of more than $500,000. Their contribution to the care will go up by about $13,000 to just under $70,000. And there is a cap of $130,000 on this whole scheme, what you contribute, so that people have some certainty about what the
And that covers everything from your home care,
clinical
to,
care.
if you do go into residential care, and the rest of it's $130,000 is the cap. Claire, there was some give and take, obviously, to arrive at that deal, that package. But both sides seem generally comfortable with where it's at?
Yeah, I think when you see the coalition talking about reserving their right to move amendments, they're really talking about the broader Aged Care Act. What's the deal is really around is this chapter that specifically looks at this funding arrangement. And Labor did come in a long way from where they wanted. They wanted that $130,000 lifetime contribution cap to be much more like $180,000. And they also wanted to include, require a bit more of a contribution on some of the other levels of home care, I believe. So I think what we've really seen is really a compromise where Labor would have liked to have gone further and the coalition would probably have liked it to not have gone as far, but that's the nature of that.
The coalition also secured this grandfathering of current people in aged care, although I'm told that was always something the government might have been willing to give away. They went in with a bit of a higher ask. But the things they haven't done are also interesting. They've rejected the Royal Commission's recommendation for a levy to pay for all of this on working age taxpayers. And they've also rejected any notion here that the family home and how that's treated would change as well.
These reforms are the next step in lifting the quality of aged care. Many things will change, but some important things won't. The family home won't be treated any different than it is now. There will not be a levy. Government investment in aged care will rise year on year.
So, Waleed, this instead will see those self-funded retirees, people with more money, pay more. This gets to that equity issue. Is this the fairest approach?
Well, that's a philosophical question. So that
well, who better to?
Well, no, that depends on if you think user pays is fair, or you think the levy is fair because what that's doing is spreading it across the entire community,
socialising the cost.
Yeah, and what that would mean, and this was the Royal Commission's point, I think, was that in the end we all benefit from spending on aged care eventually.
Yeah.
And so you make that contribution quite specifically quarantined, and I think that's the philosophical part of it, is that you make that statement as a nation, as a polity, that we are going to commit this, that there's a bond of solidarity there right, over time. So anyway, once you leave that aside, if you cross the threshold of saying we're not going to do a levy, or even send it to the Productivity Commission for analysis, which is what the Royal Commission suggested, because there were two separate levies. Anyway, once you
they
decide,
had different ideas, didn't they, the Royal Commissioners? But anyway.
Yeah. But once you set that aside, then equity is the language that the Royal Commission kept using. And so equity is not the same as equality, and equity does imply the same thing as sort of progressive taxation. So those who can afford will do.
You can understand, though, the argument from some who are saying, well, we've worked all our lives and been self-sustainable in retirement, and now we're going to have to pay more for this care.
Yeah, that's right. And that's an argument that typically belongs in the mouth of the coalition. And you hear it over and over again on things like superannuation. So there's some strength to that argument. But what you're talking about here is there is already a contribution that people are making. Probably the strongest argument, I think, for this particular tweak is that the extra money that you're paying, especially when it comes to at-home care, tends to cover things you would probably have to be paying for yourself anyway.
Yeah, which is what the government's saying. Your actual clinical care is still covered by the taxpayer, but it's that, if you're gardening or the haircut, like those sort of things that you might get at home.
And surely the government doesn't fund that simply because you're now in aged care if you were going to fund that anyway. There's probably an exception to that though, and that is things like showering and that sort of care. So that seems to be something that you would bear. And then of course there's the maximum contribution over time, which is really where it's at, because ultimately it doesn't matter if you have to pay more in a particular year if the overall contribution is going to be the same, but that's going up, and obviously that's
presumably more people will hit that cap. Gets to this political question that faced Peter Dutton and the coalition here, because it is their base really. The self-funded retirees typically vote coalition that are being asked to pay more here, and here was the opposition leader explaining why then he's agreed to back this.
We've worked with the government because we think it's in our national interest to do so. We've got an ageing population and we want to make sure that people have dignity in retirement.
So the national interest, Jacob, is being put first here, he says.
And political interest as well. I mean, there's a degree to which if he wins the next election, he would like this issue dealt with. There's always been a view that this is the kind of issue that Labor is better placed to take the lead on. There will be concerns for him on his side. It was interesting, Phil Curry reported that the deal was finally struck the other day when both the Prime Minister and Dutton flew back from the greeting for the Paralympians.
It's actually, shout out to Phil. It was a really interesting TikTok of how that week played out in the negotiations.
And it looked very, very dicey at a certain point. And it seems that conversation might have got the principals back in to push hard, and they had a sudden joint party room to get.
Nonetheless, in that joint party room, Claire, there is some concern, and particularly from Nats, worried about a lot of retirees and a lot of those seats who are going to have to pay more.
I think that, they are worried, except they now have the advantage of they're worried about One Nation. I'm not sure the extent to which that will turn out to be a problem electorally for them, but it's pretty rare to get to a point where you've put $12 billion back into your coffers over the next decade and you're not going to get hit by your main political opponent for the mechanism used to do it. So, I mean, yes, there's a bit of dithering on this, but I think take the win for the sake of
what's the
budget.
counterfactual? If they'd opposed this, they'd be seen as reckless on the budget and not willing to improve the quality.
And they'd have to find the money themselves.
And you could also say that, bracket creep is going to catch more and more millennials as they rise through the income thresholds. They would be the losers, because they would be funding this shortfall, this $12 billion saving that this produces. That it'd be coming out of income taxes.
And they're already shouldering comparatively high income taxes, struggling to buy a home. All of these
so the idea that sort of wealthy, self-funded retirees shouldn't be contributing, that's the sort of red hot.
This is this intergenerational inequity issue. Just in terms of sealing a deal, getting reform done, as I mentioned, we don't see this all that often. Are there lessons out of how this was done, what happened here, how both sides reached this point? Because, Waleed, it's a while since we've seen something like this.
Yeah, I'm actually not sure the last time we saw something on this scale quite like this. Yeah, there are lessons. One is that you can't do it in public, because the minute that this was a confidential...
And that's frustrating.
And it is frustrating.
It's not ideal.
And maybe that's our fault in the media as much as anything, but it is true. Once these things become public debates, then lines offer themselves up, and politicians are not in the position of refusing those lines when it allows a clear attack line. So if you look at a lot of the great transitions in Australian politics, they tend to come at a moment where the parties get together and agree to take it off the table as some kind of political issue. I mean, going way back, the advent of multiculturalism is an example of that. Right? Once Labor and the Liberals, in that case the Fraser Liberals, decided we're not going to make an issue of this, then suddenly you can make things happen. But once it's in the public, that becomes less of an option. You start getting agitation, you start getting nervous backbenchers, etc., and then it becomes difficult. But the other thing I would say about this that's fascinating is the language around it from the sector is fascinating, because they're saying what we need is a funding model. The Royal Commission asked for that. Why do we need a funding model? Because that will attract investment. And so we need the certainty of a government agreement on this to attract investment. Where have we heard that argument before?
Energy debate rings a bell. No, it does, but it's a good point. But look, they needed the money. About half of the centres providers are running at a loss. So clearly they did need some certainty.
Well, I think this is something that those anxious backbenchers should take heart from, is this wasn't a request of self-funded retirees in particular to pay something for nothing. They're going to ostensibly get better infrastructure, better residential care. There's things in that deal, for example, that all clinical care in residential aged care is now covered by the government, whereas it previously wasn't all covered. So it's a better standard of care, which was kind of the point of the whole Royal Commission.
It does raise an expectation, though, that you will be able to stay in your home in those final years. And I do have a question in my mind about, do we have the labour resources to actually deliver that level of care? You do want to stay in your own home. Everyone agrees with that, but that requires a lot of humans.
And precisely how expensive
spread out
will
over,
that end up being once you...
Exactly.
Yes.
A lot of humans spread out over a large area in suburbs rather than, in a palliative care area or a hospital or a hospice that's
which is inevitably going to be more efficient, you would think, to provide that.
Right. So it doesn't sound like a productivity improvement, and of course no one wants to talk about that with a subject as sensitive as this. But that is an underlying reality here.
That's a good point.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, I mean, things like the $15,000 to modify your home, this stops things like grandma has a fall, goes to hospital, she's got stairs at home, so straight into residential aged care you go. There are degrees of, wanting to stay at home, and I think there is potentially a productivity measure in just facilitating that so that you are really kind of having end-of-life care almost in residential.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Just one last political point, if I may. Yeah. The Coalition does have a story to tell on this that allows it to get the budget benefit, and that is the nasty bits they knocked off. So you mentioned the grandfathering, we mentioned the cap.
Yeah.
But the one thing we haven't mentioned is that cap also applies to at-home care. That was a big win for them because the Labor Party only wanted it to apply to residential care.
Yeah.
Now, the telling comment in the package that you just played is this is Labor's bill. They will tell that story over and over and over again.
Well, just on that, let's get to the Shadow Finance Minister, Jane Hume. And as we heard, Peter Dutton says he's working with the government on this in the interests of, the national interest. But this is yet to go to a vote in Parliament, and the Coalition is keen, it says, to hear feedback before a final vote.
Obviously, through the committee process, we'll be putting through some ideas that we think will improve this legislation because, as I said, we've only agreed to the part of this legislation that was sufficient for the government to actually get it out there and let Australians see it.
But it is important at that Senate inquiry stage that everyone has their say. That's what Senate inquiries are about, and we want to hear from Australians.
Jane Hume, welcome to the program.
Good to be with you again, David.
So what is the Coalition supporting and what are you still unsure about in this bill?
David, the Coalition made an offer at the beginning of this term of Parliament to the government and said that we would work with them to create a sustainable aged care system because we knew that that was going to be an increasing pressure not only on the budget but also to make sure that we have a sustainable system that works for Australians in the future. And that's exactly what we've done. We worked with them particularly on the financial framework that is part of this bill, but that is only one chapter. There is far more to this bill than just that. That was what was needed to bring this bill on so that it can then be subject to the normal scrutinies, stakeholders can have a feedback, and the Senate can do an inquiry. We can understand exactly what all the implications are of this bill. But we do believe that we've got to a good place in the financial framework, and that's a good start.
So just on that main financial point that self-funded retirees will pay up to $13,400 a year more, you're supporting that?
Well, we said that from the beginning that we would work with the government to get that financial framework to a point where we were comfortable. There were important elements to that, and you've mentioned some of them already. Things like grandfathering, so that people that are already on their aged care journey will not pay a single cent more. That was fundamentally important. We also wanted to make sure that there were caps in place, that there were appropriate tapering rates. These are fundamentally important, but there were also other aspects too that we have worked with the government on. We wanted to, for instance, make sure that there was no criminal penalties within the system for aged care workers, because that would essentially drive workers away. So these are part of the negotiations that allowed the government to bring that bill on. Now we'll go through our regular processes to understand exactly how it's going to affect Australians.
OK, but if there is blowback from self-funded retirees over that impost that they'll face, are you hedging your bets on that, or are you locked in? You'll back that increased fee for self-funded retirees?
We've said that we will support the financial framework going forward, but there are other aspects to the bill that need to be considered, and that's what bringing it on will allow it to do. The government was delaying bringing it on. It's delayed bringing it on for months and months, but it does need some scrutiny, and we want to see that feedback from stakeholders and from those of the participants.
Anything you oppose at the moment in the bill?
Not that we've seen. We are concerned about the workforce strategy. We've been calling for some years now for a national care workforce strategy. That's something we are yet to see, because we need to make sure that there is the workforce there to support the reforms that are being put into place.
Looking at spending more broadly beyond just aged care, you've been criticising the government for increasing spending by $315 billion. Will the coalition cut spending?
The coalition have committed to going to the next election with a credible alternative budget, and that's exactly what we will do. The government has spent an additional $315 billion since coming to government that the coalition would not have committed to and didn't commit to back at the last election. Some of that spending has been undisciplined and unnecessary. So, of course, you'll see us go through and make sure that any wasteful or unnecessary or undisciplined spending that is pushing inflation up further, making inflation be higher for longer, and therefore pushing interest rates to be higher for longer, is wound back. And we've made that clear. There's been elements that the government have put forward, policies that the government have put forward, that we have pushed back on.
The government says, though, that this means you'll be cutting into spending on the age pension and health. Can you clear that up? Will you cut spending on health or the age pension?
Well, that's just Labor talking points and total nonsense. And you can understand why a panicked government might say something so idiotic. Of course we're not going to cut back on the age pension. Of course we're not going to cut back on the essential services that Australians need and deserve. Of course we're not going to cut back on social safety nets. But if this government thinks that there isn't undisciplined or unnecessary spending in their budgets, well, they're fooling themselves. There's $13.7 billion of production tax credits going to miners to do what they were already doing. There's $1 billion to support solar panels that even the Productivity Commissioner says are never going to be competitive. There's $500 million to go towards batteries that the Treasury Secretary says we don't need. There's $620,000 for a speechwriter for Bill Shorten to be more empathetic. Okay. There is plenty in this budget. There's plenty in the government's coffers that is unnecessary or undisciplined spending that is pushing inflation up further.
So no cuts to health or the age pension. What about childcare?
Well, we've said we will not be cutting essential services. We will not be cutting the social safety nets that people need. Well, if that's a social safety net, that's an essential service. So we have no intention to cut childcare.
Okay, so no cuts to childcare, health, the age pension. The cuts would be where you mentioned the Future Made in Australia. The miners say they actually need that tax incentive to do critical mineral processing. You won't offer them that?
Well, there are plenty of ways to support the critical minerals, rare earths and other sectors in the mining industry that need support. And the first step would be making sure that we have a productive economy that has an industrial relations system that is flexible not just for employees but also for employers, that we have lower energy costs,
does that mean you get rid of
cut red tape and regulation, and that we have lower and simpler, fairer taxes. This is the productivity agenda that the coalition will take to the next election. That's what miners are crying out for,
so
not simply a production tax credit for what they're already doing.
When you say industrial relations, getting it back to basics, will you scrap the same job, same pay legislation?
Well, we'll certainly look at multi-employer bargaining, because we believe that multi-employer bargaining, going back to that old patent bargaining system of the 1970s, is a regressive step that actually reduces productivity and competitiveness of our sector. We've said that we'll redefine casual back to its original definition, because that's actually adding inflexibility to our workplace practices, not improving it. And the right to disconnect laws are something that will need to be considered, because quite frankly, this is stuff that can be negotiated between an employee and an employer. These are unnecessary laws that are adding more complexity to our system rather than removing it.
But the question was the same job, same pay laws. Will you scrap those?
Well, there will be elements of that we will certainly have to consider because, as we said, those industrial relations reforms that the government have implemented are wrapping up our big businesses and our small businesses, but particularly our small businesses, in red tape that they simply cannot afford, which is why we're seeing productivity in this country go backwards.
So you will look
by
at
6.3% in the last 2 years alone. You cannot have economic growth and lower inflation sustainably unless you improve productivity. There is no productivity agenda from this government. In fact, it's an anti-productivity agenda.
Okay, so you will look at the same job, same pay laws. Do you think miners, airline workers and so on, who are on labour hire, with labour hire firms, do you think they should be paid less?
Well, I've said no, of course not. Of course not. That's a ridiculous question, David. We will look at all of the industrial relations laws to make sure that they are fairer, both for employees and for employers, but most importantly that we inject productivity back into the system. We all want higher pay. But Philip Lowe, the previous Reserve Bank Governor, and indeed this Reserve Bank Governor, Michelle Bullock, have reminded us that you simply cannot have wage rises without corresponding productivity growth, otherwise it's inflationary. And we cannot afford to have inflation stay higher for longer.
But if you're employed by a labour hire firm, you should get the same pay if you're doing the same job.
I'm not going to get into the details of industrial relations. That's not my portfolio. But what I will say is that if we don't have a more flexible industrial relations system, we are going to see productivity continue to go backwards.
With respect, Senator, this is what, when it comes to the detail, this is what a lot of those workers are worried about. Are they going to get a pay cut? When you talk about all this simpler, more productive, are they going to get a pay cut?
We want to see sustainable wage rises that are backed in by productivity.
But will you repeal that law and will they have a pay cut as a result?
We'll be reviewing industrial relations laws, and Michaelia Cash has made this very clear. Peter Dutton has made this clear. Right. We'll be reviewing industrial relations laws to make sure that we improve the productivity of our economy.
And that would be in government.
Not just
the review would be in government. You're not going to say before the election what you do on this?
Well, we've been very clear about elements of the industrial relations system that we would review.
And that would happen in government. So post-election, this would be reviewed.
Well, I'm afraid that changing industrial relations laws from opposition is impossible, David.
Right.
So, of course, it would happen in government. But we want to make sure that people get their pay rises. That's no doubt about that. But you cannot have pay rises without corresponding productivity, or you have inflation. If you have inflation, all Australians suffer.
OK, but going to the election, there will be a question mark then for a lot of workers as to what's going to happen to their pay. You'll review all of this after the election.
Well, David, I think we're going round in circles here.
No,
We've said that we're going to...
Question for those who are worried about their pay.
Well, they shouldn't be worried about their pay, but they should be worried about the state of the economy, and they should be worried about inflation. Because if we haven't got a growing economy, then we can't afford to spend more on the essential services we need. If we have inflation, that's going to eat away at your pay. It's going to erode your savings, and it's going to reduce your standard of living and your quality of life. We have to get the balance right here, and injecting productivity back into our economy is fundamental to that.
What will your plan for nuclear power cost? Have you worked that out yet?
So the government has, the opposition has been very clear on this one from the beginning, that we believe that in the long term, having nuclear as part of our energy mix is the way to get those emissions back down to net zero emissions, but more importantly, having a reliable and efficient and affordable energy mix.
Okay, but the cost
and that's
is
what
the
nuclear
question?
will be part of that. Well, everywhere around the world, we've seen when nuclear power is part of that mix that energy prices come down. At the moment, Australians are paying around 56 cents per kilowatt hour in places like Ontario, where nuclear is
There's
about 60%
a lot of other parts
of the mix
world
there.
that use nuclear than Ontario, and a lot of them have higher
Tennessee.
prices. I think Quebec next door. But what's the cost going to be of your policy?
Well, hang on. I think the most important thing here, David, is that when nuclear is part of the energy mix, we see energy prices come down. And in places like Ontario, they have 14 cents per kilowatt hour. In Tennessee,
a lot of experts
it's
would
around
challenge that.
18,
I'm just asking about
18 cents per kilowatt hour.
What's the cost going to be, and when are we going to see this?
Well, we'll make our announcement on the cost of our nuclear policy in due course, but in advance of the election. The most important thing here, well, in advance of the election. If the election's this year, well, of course, that is the case. But if you listen to the Prime Minister, you'd think that the election was going to be potentially even 9 months away. But the most important thing here, David, is that when we do announce our policies, our costings on our energy mix, it's about the energy mix. You've got to make sure you're comparing apples with apples. So we want to compare our energy mix, proposed energy mix, with Labor's proposed energy mix. Our energy mix is going to include renewables and gas, and in the long term it will also include nuclear.
And those renewables investors, should they be continuing to invest now, or should they wait and see what you're going to do with nuclear power? Because that'll affect their investments.
Well, renewables are inevitably going to be a part of that energy mix,
so
and we'll have more to say. We'll have more to say about our renewables policy very soon, and indeed our gas policy as well. But making sure that we cost the entire system as opposed to just one element is fundamentally important if we're going to compare apples with apples.
Look, what's the Coalition's position now on reforming the Reserve Bank? Do you think there should be two boards, a governance board and a monetary policy board?
We have worked with the government for a number of months now in good faith on the reforms that they proposed. But there were two elements which we thought were fundamentally important. One of them was that maintaining the independence and the stability and the confidence in the Reserve Bank. But the other was that there was continuity between that monetary policy board from the existing board. Maintaining stability and continuity on that board is fundamental for fighting inflation, and that should be the government's number one priority. That was the government's sticking point. Now, bizarrely, the Treasurer then went into war with the RBA and essentially tried to undermine their independence, which we found very confronting.
Just back to the question, do you want two boards or stick with one?
Well, quite frankly, I think that it's time that the government moved on.
But
the most important thing that they could do, well, if they wanted two boards, they needed to have stability and continuity between the monetary policy board and the existing board that were making those decisions.
If you're in government, do you want two boards or one?
I think we're beyond this now. I think that, if the government, the government won't negotiate on that piece, I understand that. Maintaining that.
What's your position? If you win the election, would you move to two boards or just one?
We feel that this is no longer something that needs to be talked about. It's no longer on the table.
Stick with the current arrangement.
You stick with the current arrangements because you need that continuity and stability of the current board. That's the job that these people were hired to do. They were hired to do monetary policy, and they should continue to do monetary policy. If the government doesn't want to countenance that, if they want to go and do a deal with the Greens, well, I think that speaks volumes of their motives as to what it is that they want to do.
You would stick with the current structure.
We are not going to allow them to sack and stack the monetary policy, the board,
in government,
in order to put their own folk on there.
Okay, I understand that, but in government, you'd stick with just one board.
We're comfortable with the board that we have that are dealing with monetary policy as they are. That's the best way to get inflation down, which should be the number one priority.
Final one, your colleague Karen Andrews, who's leaving at the election, says her view on quotas for women in Parliament has softened over the past decade. The Liberals need to do better, she says, in boosting the number of women in Parliament. Has your view on quotas shifted at all?
David, it will come as no surprise to you, as one of the authors of the review after the last 2022 election, that my view hasn't changed. The party has set targets over 3 elections in 10 years to reach 50% of female parliamentarians, but more importantly, also 50% new female members and 50% women in elected positions, in office-bearing positions within the party, because that's how you build that pipeline organically and make sure that genuine change, that genuine cultural change occurs from the bottom up.
Is it working?
Well, the Liberal Party is not an authoritarian structure. Quotas will only work if to change the culture if the messaging comes from the top down. That's not how the Liberal Party works. We're a bottom-up grassroots organisation, and we want to make sure that the culture change is organic. That's how you create it, real and lasting change.
Would you say it's working?
Well, I've been working with a heap of our female candidates for the next election, and I'm very excited by who we've got out there. Katie Mullins in Parramatta, and Ro Knox in Wentworth, and Maggie Forrest in Ryan, and Katie Allen in Chisholm, and Amelia Hamer in Kooyong, and Mary Aldred in Monash. I mean, these are amazing women.
Okay.
They're amazing women, and I am so excited to have them join the team because they are going to make a real difference.
Senator Jane Hume, appreciate you joining us this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
All right, well, let's get back to our panel for a bit more on this. We're joined once again by Jacob Greber, Clare Armstrong and Waleed Aly. Look, I just want to pick up on a couple of things there, Jacob, because I know you've been focused on the Reserve Bank review.
Yeah.
The Coalition now saying they'll stick with the current structure in government. So does that end this whole question about reforming the Reserve Bank? Or
the question now is with the government and the Greens, where the Treasurer tries to get these reforms through with the help of the Greens party, and that's a trickier question than it might look on the surface, because from the get-go, the Treasurer wanted this to be a bipartisan thing.
Yeah.
And that's about the institution, trust in the institution, not just here. This is being watched globally because the Reserve Bank is one of those institutions that financial markets keep a very close eye on. If there's any sniff that this is politicised, that would be very dangerous. So that's where this thing is now at.
And just on IR as well, the Coalition would review in government all of these things, including that same job, same pay. Does that leave a question mark, do you think, heading into the election as to whether the labour hire workers and the mines and the airlines and so on are going to cop a hit?
I think it does. I think the government will leap on those comments to certainly play that card. The person serving the coffee on the Qantas jet will get less. The worker out there in the Pilbara will get less. That'll be the argument. And the degree to which it's just politically effective, we'll see. I thought the other interesting thing was that Jane Hume was leaning into this $315 billion figure, which Labor's been using to sort of frame the scale of their cuts, as it were, because that spending that Hume and the Coalition says is excessive, or they wouldn't have done. But they're not scared of that number, and I think the politics of that is interesting. That sort of goes to those voters, I think.
But they won't cut essential services, she said.
It won't be that big, the number.
Health and the age pension and childcare and so on.
But I think it's that fear that voters have now when they hear a new spending announcement. I think there is now a connection to the inflation story and their mortgage rates when they hear those big announcements.
But it's also, this is happening in the context of an anaemic economy. So that's the other side of the equation. That'll be the counter. And that's, I think, why Labor aren't that scared of it, because their argument will be, and I think there's an economic case for it, that you rip that out, well, we're in recession, and then what, right? And so this is why inflation is such a horrible problem to solve. You have two ways of solving it, really. One is you can bring it down quickly. And end up in recession, or you can bring it down slowly.
I mean, it is a number. It's a number over many, many years, though. So you're not pulling 315 out of the economy this year. It's true.
Let's turn to an area where both major parties also seem to be on the same page, and that is banning kids from social media. This debate's been going a while. Peter Malinauskas, Labor Premier in South Australia, really led the charge on this. Other states started to join in. Peter Dutton a few months ago also agreed that there needed to be a 16-year age limit for social media. And now the Prime Minister, well, he was under pressure to jump on board as well, and he's done so this week and really now wants to lead the charge federally to have a nationally consistent approach to this.
Well, we're listening to parents and listening to the community, and I want to see kids off their devices and onto the footy fields and the swimming pools and the tennis courts. We want them to have real experiences with real people.
Yeah, real experiences with real people. Expect to hear that line, I guess, a bit more, Claire. What do you think here? I mean, the argument is, why can't we just get back to the good old days and kids roaming around?
Yeah, I actually think that's the wrong argument, and that's actually quite a reductive way to look at this issue of, back in my day, kids ran around outside. Well, it's actually not really about that. It's about these platforms and the actual active harms that they are perpetuating against children. And I think, yes, we'll see a bit of that, but hopefully more and more we'll see both the government and the opposition sort of sharpening their commentary around this, because it's not a case of, oh, well, Jimmy's lost an hour to scrolling on TikTok when he could have been kicking the footy. It's, has he ended up in an Andrew Tate algorithm death spiral and now has some pretty complicated and incorrect opinions about women and their role in the world? Or is it a girl? I mean, the rate of eating disorders among Australian women under 19 has increased 200% since 2012. So I think that they are right to say that they are capturing this concern from parents, but I actually think it's a bit reductive to paint it as something as simple as switch off and go out and kick a football. It's actually quite a serious health issue.
Yeah, look, he's tapping into, though, Waleed, where parents are largely at on this, right? The level of concern so many parents have about what's happening to their kids on social media and how they're seeing teenage kids change their behaviour is pretty clear. But is it clear that a ban is the way to go?
Well, it's not clear that it will stop them being on social media. This is one of the issues. It's also not clear exactly what this ban would look like. Which model are they adopting? The government is trialling this age verification technology. I still am not entirely sure. I mean, it would have helped if they'd done a press conference or released a briefing note about any of this. So we're kind of punching in the dark a bit here. But like, I still don't quite understand the point.
I guess that's a technical question, is it, about the technology? And it's a reasonable one
well,
about how it works.
It's more than technical. Again, philosophical, or it's about the policy design. Because if you look at the South Australian model, right, which was put together by former Chief Justice Robert French. Let's call it the French model, not the country. Okay. So in that model, really the idea is you put the onus on the tech companies, right? And if you're doing that, you don't need a government-tested age verification tool. That's your problem, and you sort it out. Now, there are all sorts of legal arguments about precisely how you make it their problem. Do you have an absolute standard? Do you have a reasonableness test, which would mean that it's relative to what's available and possible at the time? All these things you could argue, but in no version of that do you need a government-approved or a government-sanctioned age verification model. So I find this policy a little bit confused in that way. Then there's the argument about, will people just get around it? And I think this is where VPN use, I think in America, when this has been tried, VPN use increased about 1,000%. So there's all those sorts.
And that's the argument that, well, the kids can still occasionally get alcohol, cigarettes, people can break the speeding limit, but we have these rules in place to send a signal, Jacob, don't we? And set a standard for parents and kids and their teachers and so on to understand that there is a general societal agreement that it's not okay to access these platforms at that age.
I think this is a big winner for the government, and it's the first time in quite a while that I've heard Albanese actually describe something in a visceral way that tells a story. He has an unfortunate habit of talking in lists quite often when he gives answers in question time, for instance, or at press conferences. Government's doing this, and the other thing. It washes over your head. This last week, and you ran the quote at the beginning of the clip, that is speaking to an anxiety parents have, that their kids are not having the same childhood they had, that they are distracted and manipulated by these technologies.
And I was listening to some of the callers on radio, parents, quite emotional, almost in tears, talking about what's happening to their kids.
And look, I'm a parent, you're a parent, and I would much have preferred this was a very different world on this front. They need this technology. They're part of, you have to educate them in the technology. It's how they communicate. It's an interesting sort of position from the Greens. Their argument is quite against all of these proposals because they see that as how young people get active, get organised, and Greta Thunberg wouldn't exist without this technology, is what Sarah Hanson-Young said during the week. But I think Albanese's really hit something here that resonates.
I would just say it's important as well not to get too caught up in how to make it 100% effective or 90% effective, because this has been the lobbying strategy of these platforms for over a decade, which is to just absent themselves from any kind of responsibility. And the second it looks like someone might hold them to account, confuse and obstruct with talk of how complicated it is or how it's not really feasible. And I think the point to make about the age assurance trial is it's not actually going to be prescriptive. It's just an assessment of, is the technology capable of doing this, essentially to negate an inevitable argument from platforms saying,
just on that,
this is too hard.
The legislation that is promised will be introduced by the end of the year is not going to wait for that age verification trial.
And on top of that,
get on with just legislating or introducing legislation. Might not get voted on before the election, but because it would have to go to a committee and all of that. But it's about signalling, is it?
Yes, and on top of that, no one who supports raising the minimum minimum age of social media says that that is all you do, that this is the solution in isolation. Of course, digital literacy is important. Of course, putting as much responsibility back on the platforms to deal with their algorithms, to have better privacy protections is a part of that. But these are companies who have completely absented themselves from any kind of responsibility.
Not all experts agree this is the best way to go. I spoke for the podcast this week to Professor Sonia Livingston. She's one of the leading global researchers on this at the London School of Economics. And look, she argues that a ban is not necessarily the best way of dealing with what is the problem here.
We have made it quite hard for children to go out freely and mix with each other after school. Parents are very worried about traffic. They've kept their children home. You know, social media for society has become the way for children to see their friends, to hang out, to kind of share a culture together. So now to ban social media leaves us with a problem.
You can watch that full conversation with the QR codes there, but this is the argument that we've become a lot more anxious about letting the kids roam the streets.
That is such a cop-out. That is such a cop-out. Half of my family lives, my brother's family live in Switzerland. Those kids have to walk to school every day because that society mandates that getting in cars and being driven to school is not acceptable. And they've ensured that, you know, those kids get looked after and make it to school and back. They don't have that level of anxiety that was expressed in that clip. I think that's a cop-out.
I think Australia does have a high level of anxiety. We are quite an anxious country over stuff like this, and maybe media coverage.
And there are other countries that don't have that anxiety.
That's true.
Now, that's a big cultural shift for us, right?
It is, and so I would make 2 points. One is the point I think her point overlooks is that one of the reasons that social media is how they socialise is that is the most convenient and live option, right? So if you were successful in taking that option away, they will find other ways to socialise.
They're human beings,
so we can't presuppose, you can't presuppose the existence of social media in a world to assess what a world without it would look like. It doesn't work that way. Okay, that's one thing. But the other thing is, absolutely this is a political winner. And government, I think, has to be seen to be doing something. And Anthony Albanese was kind of dragged to this, I think, by the premiers anyway.
And by the opposition.
And by the opposition.
We can't have a state-by-state approach. Right?
No, arguably you can't have a country-by-country approach, though. This is another, I mean, that's another, and that bedevils a lot of areas, climate change, illegal immigration, anyway, tax, a whole lot of things. But I think the other side of this is, deep down, the deep roots of this problem are civil society roots. And it has to do with parents, for example, being able to delay in their own households the adoption of these things. Or the point that she does make that is really valid is if you create civil society environments like you describe in Switzerland that militate against this sort of thing, now you have a way of weaning people off social media. That's just a government can't address that. And so we're looking for government policy to solve a much deeper...
The problem is if we are anxious as parents about letting kids, you know, and whether it's the traffic or whether it's pedophiles or whatever you're worried about, the problem is on social media there are so many people reaching them in their bedrooms that you're just not aware of.
What's more scary, the ability of them to reach into the bedroom?
But there might be other ways. So, important thing that Chief Justice French made, an important comment he made is there are actually two objections to this. One is the content on social media, which is what everyone seems to be focusing on. The other, which is a very powerful objection and is not receiving enough attention, is it's to do with the platform and the mechanism itself and the addiction pathways, etc. And if you do that, now you're having a very different conversation that's not about entry to social media. You're talking about access to smartphones, for example. And now this is a totally different world. But if you really wanted to get stuck in, you would have to start considering questions like that. And there's no appetite for that.
Interesting to see that story I mentioned earlier about the ban on smartphones or phones in schools in New South Wales seems to be delivering some positive results. Look, so much happened this week. We don't have time to go through the full list, but the environment law debate, I just want to pick up on this because this has been really interesting during the week. And Jacob, I know you've been writing about this particularly. So government promises new environment laws, trying to do a deal with the coalition. They're not there, the coalition not particularly interested. The Minerals Council, the mining industry, want the government to, want the coalition to do this deal to set up an environment protection agency, but they're not so far. So then Tanya Plibersek, the minister, fronts up at the Minerals event during the week and suggests she might be open to a deal with the Greens.
Could you rule it out, a climate trigger, climate consideration?
Tanya, I've got to be clear, we are in intense negotiations right across the parliament. I'm not going to pretend to you that there's there's no discussion of climate considerations as part of this negotiation. I can't pretend that.
So the Greens want this climate consideration or climate trigger before approvals are given to assess what impact a project might have on the climate. The minister suggested she might be open to that, but Jacob, are they?
No, the government is not in a position to go down that road. We began the hour talking about how successful the aged care reform has been. This is on the brink of going down as a masterclass in how you mess this sort of stuff up. There was common ground a year ago. Tanya Plibersek stood with the Business Council and the environment groups, and everybody is wanting their piece of this, and a reform that the environmental movement has been asking for decades for is on the cusp of collapsing because they're trying to shoehorn a climate change issue into the bill. Now, the government, as you suggested, David, is not going down that road.
They're not.
Anthony Albanese's worried about the West. Yeah, he's worried about the resources state.
For good reason. Yeah. Take a look at, after those comments, here's what the West Australian ran on its front page. Yeah. Labor's war on the West. Now, they have seats there they must hold on to at this election. Yeah. So they're not going to go down that path. Politically, Claire, how's this one tracking?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. It's obviously a negotiating tactic to try and force the coalition to make a deal because, better the devil you know, rather than us going off and making a deal with the Greens. But Tanya Plibersek has also been talking about how the review of the Act that these reforms are based on, that's the letter to the law that they're following. And that review explicitly said keep climate out of the Environment Act.
And that was a coalition era.
And it was a coalition era review. So I think she's obviously trying to accelerate negotiations in a way that has ultimately seems to be backfiring because the coalition hasn't run to the party. They've just exploited the fact it looks like she's about to do this deal with the Greens that no one in a huge part of the community in Western Australia, for example, wants.
The only way that works politically is if they do the deal with the Greens and the coalition cop the backlash for not having done the deal. But does anyone think that's how it would?
Do they really get that much blame?
My sense is the government will want to put this to the floor of the Senate.
As it is.
And get everyone's point of view. This is the feel now is that everyone's positioning so they don't wear the blame.
Well, it's a bit like the housing bills that they're going to reintroduce in the next couple of days in the Senate as well. I don't think there's any shift from the coalition or the Greens, but they'll put it up for a vote so everyone can see where everyone
stands.
And
it's back on the list for this coming week.
And then you go to the election saying, well, here's what we're committed to at least for the next term of Parliament.
Then from the business point of view, does this then get negotiated with a minority government after the next election, if that's what happens?
The Greens might be in a
where the Greens have the whip hand.
All right, our panel, Waleed Aly, Clare Armstrong and Jacob Greber, will be back very shortly with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers, Talking Pictures.
I'm Mike Bowers and I'm photographer at large for The Guardian Australia. I'm talking pictures this morning with photographer for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, the one and only Alex Ellinghausen, and a very warm welcome back on what's been an extremely busy week.
Good morning, Mike. Thank you for having me.
Hey, Alex, that elbow got no wrist, bro. The kids must think he's totally mid.
I've got no clue what you're saying. All I know is if we start using language like that, it becomes not cool anymore.
We stole that from our own Jack the Insider. But it's to make the point that they're going to ban kids from social media. I did love this Mark Knight, who's got elbow looking into social media and it's blowing up on him. Your government is who emoji. I'm voting Greens, and he wishes he could ban adults from social media too. Albo, you're a...
Oh, just look at this expression, looking at the comments.
Yeah. David Pope has done the old social media company here. You must be at least this old as to get in here with the bouncer elbow on the door.
And to have your human desire for social connection hijacked by dopamine pirates so that the ads can be served and your data harvested.
Yeah, which is pretty much getting to the point of it. Lovely Matt Golding. We can try to protect your children, but someone will always find a way around it, and they've got the age verification with the e-safety commissioner.
I raised the legal age of responsibility to 14.
Yeah, the Victorian Aboriginal Legal Service.
Increased job seeker and youth allowance with ACOS.
No safe place for children in Gaza from UNICEF. And this made me sad. Peter Murphy in the empty chair. Blanket ban on gambling ads. Yeah. And finally, the UN Secretary General.
Limit warming to 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, this was really, really cute from John Kedelka. Back when I was a teenager, we didn't have screens.
So you simply got out in the fresh air and made your own fun?
No, we were bored out of our goddamn minds.
Oh, this is going to do some serious numbers on TikTok.
Well, content's everything, right?
It is.
Alex, this week people from the country came to the capital and they protested about live sheep exports. And also many other things. There was a bit of a grab bag of grievances from the bush.
Yeah.
Well, keep the sheep confused the hell out of me.
Look, if you really want to be pedantic, it's keep the sheep exports.
They stood on the bridges with their signs and all got terrific puns like tell Labor to flock off.
And this little one with the little dog.
I lose my job too.
Members from the coalition, the Liberals and Nats, they came out to address the...
Yeah, in force. Yeah. No stranger to protest. The cat in the hat, Bob Catter, was taking a relaxed approach.
Was it Winston Churchill that said, never stand up when you can sit down, never sit down when you can lie down?
And the other great hat was, of course, Ian Goodenough, the member for Moore, who there's a touch of the Grand Army of the Republic about him.
A little bit.
Alex, the farmers weren't the only ones protesting this week. Down in Melbourne, the Weapons Expo attracted a fair bit of attention.
Yeah, and some of the behaviour that we've heard reported of throwing of liquid that's reported to be acid and horse manure and some examples of violent behaviour.
Yeah, Kathy Wilcox sort of cut to the chase here, I thought. Can you believe the violence of these protesters?
Absolute barbarians, a lot of them, while standing in front of
tanks and missile launchers. Mark Knight, I thought, did pretty well too. These peaceful protesters sure could show this expo a thing or two about warfare. Alex, with the US election only months away, the next president is up for debate. One of the things that seemed to take everyone off guard was the handshake.
The fact that Kamala Harris actually approached his lectern.
So it's literally the side-by-side comparison, the only time you get to actually see them interact.
He grabs people, he does that. And, it does a bit of that.
Yeah. The spectacle of what went on with this, though, was just superb. I did love this Kathy Wilcox. It was rigged. She stole the debate with him over the shoulder. David Rowe, who's got taken a new meaning for Swift boat because Taylor Swift, of course, came out.
She's got a massive following.
Debate, he's titled it, and he took it, the hook, line and sinker.
What a catch. Look at everything else that's coming out.
I know, it's coming out, dogs and cats. Yeah. I do love the tattoos, Putin on his backside here. And Orban on the arm. David Pope hit the nail on the head with this one. He's got Taylor Swift here chasing a cat is
this the moment where it's just started to unravel?
Making his pitch to America's childless cat ladies. Millions of immigrants are eating your cats. Alex, it's been a great pleasure unpicking events this week, and I'll let you do the honours.
Thank you for having me, Mike, and back to you, David.
Very good. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Waleed.
Worth marking the government's decision or attempt to, I guess, close off the Greber inquiry recommendations by stripping medals from some mid-ranking commanders. This has caused outrage all over the place, and I think at the heart of it's going to be a philosophical inconsistency. It'll be hard to escape, which is if, as a very senior commander, you are sufficiently in control to get a medal, then presumably you're sufficiently in control to lose it.
Responsibility.
Yeah.
Indeed. Claire.
Similar defence theme this week. The government received the Royal Commission into Veteran and Defence Suicides, 122 recommendations. And if you're wondering what the culture in our Defence Force is like, you need only look at recommendations such as that when people are being promoted in leadership, you consider their level of emotional intelligence. That pastoral care is an important factor in leadership. Things like prioritising getting rid of sexual assault and harassment in the ADF. The fact that these very basic workplace expectations have to be spelled out after 3 years of work, I think is an absolute indictment on our forces.
Yeah, no, well said. Jacob.
Interesting some news items from a brand new institution that was a big part of the last election, with the independents pushing for a national anti-corruption commission. They announced during the week, quite interesting to see how this institution develops. They've cleared Karen Chester, who's the former ASIC watchdog, of any kind of corruption. She was referred by someone. And I think that's an important signal by the Commission that they will be doing these sorts of things, because some of these things can be weaponised against individuals. And they've also said they're investigating 6 politicians, which has sort of got people running the old who is it game. One lobbyist rang me during the week saying, who is it? I hope it's not one of my clients or someone my clients need to talk to. But that's the nature of this sort of institution, and it's taken some big steps in, establishing where its boundaries are.
Yeah, and we may not know who they are.
We may never know.
Depending on where they go. Thank you all very much for joining us this morning. Finally, Cecil is a name you don't hear too often these days, but it had a good run this week when the Treasurer was asked how Cecil is coping with the cost of living. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
That the $315 billion they want to cut would do untold damage to the pensioners of this country, including, by the sounds of it, Cecil. Every time we say that those opposite need to come clean on these cuts, Cecil should keep an ear out. Cecil should keep an ear out, Mr. Speaker.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.